Margaret stepped onto the plane, gripping her small carry-on bag tightly. The airport had been exhausting, and now all she wanted was to settle into her seat and rest. She moved carefully, her steps slow but steady, her silver hair neatly pulled back. Despite her age, there was a quiet grace in the way she carried herself. She glanced down at her boarding pass, seat 14A, by the window. A comfortable spot where she could lean against the side and watch the world drift by. But as she reached her row, she stopped. A younger man, likely in his early 30s, was already sitting in her seat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a casual hoodie and jeans. Large headphones covered his ears, and he scrolled through his phone, completely at ease. Margaret hesitated before speaking, her voice soft but clear. "Excuse me, dear. I believe that's my seat." The man barely glanced up, pretending not to hear her. He shifted slightly but didn't move. Margaret tried again. "I'm supposed to be sitting by the window." She held up her ticket as proof. This time he let out a sigh, pulling off one headphone. "Yeah, I know," he muttered, "but I need the extra space. Middle seats are the worst." Margaret blinked, surprised by his bluntness. She wasn't sure what to say. A flight attendant passing by noticed the exchange and stopped. "Is there a problem here?" Before Margaret could answer, the man spoke first. "Nah, no problem. I'm already here, and she can just take the middle seat. It's not a big deal." The flight attendant frowned. "Sir, if this is her assigned seat, I'll have to ask you to move." But instead of arguing, Margaret gave a small smile and shook her head. "It's all right. I don't want to cause trouble." The attendant hesitated, but then nodded and walked away. Margaret slowly lowered herself into the middle seat, adjusting her bag on her lap. The man, clearly relieved, put his headphones back on and leaned toward the window, claiming the space that was never his to begin with. Margaret let out a quiet sigh and folded her hands in her lap. She wasn't one for confrontation. Besides, it was just a seat. Or at least, that's what Ryan thought. The plane rumbled as it taxied down the runway, and Margaret adjusted herself in the cramped middle seat. Ryan, the man who had taken her spot, had already made himself comfortable. He leaned against the window, stretching his legs slightly into her space, completely unbothered. Margaret said nothing. She simply clasped her hands together and stared ahead, her face calm but tired. As the plane lifted into the sky, Ryan pulled his hood up and closed his eyes, shutting out the world. He didn't glance her way, didn't acknowledge her presence. Margaret shifted slightly, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into her bones. The middle seat was always the least comfortable, but she wasn't about to complain. She had spent her life learning to pick her battles, and this wasn't one of them. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks. When they reached their row, Margaret politely declined, but Ryan took a soda, barely murmuring a thanks before popping his headphones back on. The hum of the plane filled the air, interrupted only by the occasional murmur of conversation from other passengers. Margaret pulled a small, well-worn notebook from her bag. Its leather cover was soft from years of use. She flipped it open to a blank page and began writing, her pen gliding smoothly across the paper. Ryan noticed out of the corner of his eye, but didn't pay much attention. He figured she was jotting down a grocery list or writing a letter to a grandchild. Something simple, something unimportant. He wouldn't have guessed how wrong he was. A slight turbulence made the plane jolt, and Margaret's hand instinctively clutched the armrest. Ryan scoffed under his breath, amused by her reaction. "Relax, it's just a little bump," he muttered, still not bothering to look at her. Margaret didn't reply. She simply let go of the armrest, took a steady breath, and returned to her writing. On her other side, the woman in the aisle seat noticed. Unlike Ryan, she was paying attention, and soon, she would change everything. The woman sitting on Margaret's other side had been watching quietly, taking in the situation. She was in her 40s, well-dressed but not flashy, with a kind face that held curiosity. Unlike Ryan, she noticed the way Margaret's hands moved across the pages of her notebook, not with idle scribbles, but with purpose. After a few minutes, the woman leaned slightly toward her. "Excuse me," she said softly, not wanting to startle her. "I couldn't help but notice. You're writing something. Are you a writer?" Margaret looked up, surprised by the question. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "I suppose you could say that," she said warmly. Ryan, still half listening to his music, barely reacted. He'd already assumed it was just some personal journaling. Nothing worth paying attention to. But the woman's interest didn't fade. That's wonderful. Have you published anything? Margaret hesitated for a moment, as if debating how much to say. Then she gave a small nod. Yes, a few things here and there. Ryan smirked slightly at that. He figured she had written a self-published memoir or a collection of short stories that barely anyone had read. Nothing major. The woman's curiosity deepened. What's your name? She asked. Margaret looked at her kindly and spoke her full name. The reaction was instant. The woman's eyes widened and she gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. No way, she whispered in shock. You're Margaret Lane? Ryan frowned, finally pulling his headphones off. Something about the woman's reaction made him curious. He glanced at Margaret properly for the first time. The woman turned toward him, her excitement clear. Do you even realize who she is? She asked, almost breathless. She's the author of The Silent River, the book that was adapted into that award-winning movie a few years ago. Ryan's smirk disappeared in an instant. He blinked, his brain catching up to what he had just heard. Margaret Lane. That Margaret Lane. The name was suddenly all too familiar. The movie had been a huge hit, praised by critics, beloved by audiences. He had even watched it once, though he hadn't read the book. Slowly, he turned his head to look at Margaret again, but this time he really saw her. And just like that, regret started creeping in. Ryan felt a strange discomfort settle in his chest. He glanced between Margaret and the woman beside her, trying to process what he had just heard. Margaret Lane, the author of The Silent River. He knew the film adaptation had won awards. He remembered hearing people talk about how deeply moving the story was, how it had touched millions. He had even seen it himself, though at the time he hadn't paid much attention to who had written the original book. And now, that very author was sitting beside him, the same woman he had dismissed without a second thought. The woman in the aisle seat was nearly glowing with excitement. Your book changed my life, she told Margaret, her voice full of emotion. I read it when I was going through a really dark time, and I can't even tell you how much it meant to me. The way you wrote about loss, about finding hope again, it felt so real. Margaret smiled warmly. Thank you, she said simply, her voice carrying a quiet humility. Ryan swallowed, suddenly feeling small. He had assumed she was just another elderly woman, someone whose presence barely mattered. But she wasn't just anyone. She was someone whose words had shaped lives, someone who had poured her heart into a story that had moved the world. Passengers nearby had started to notice the conversation. A couple of them turned to look at Margaret with recognition, whispering to one another. Even a flight attendant who was passing by paused briefly, eyes widening as she overheard the name. Ryan shifted uncomfortably. He could feel his own arrogance wrapping around him like a tight rope. Just an hour ago, he had taken her seat without a second thought, dismissing her like she was less important than him. And now he realized he had stolen the window seat from a literary legend. For the first time since the flight began, he felt something new. Guilt. Ryan's face grew warm as the weight of his actions settled in. He had been rude, dismissive, completely oblivious to who Margaret was and what she had accomplished. Now, surrounded by people who admired her, he felt like a fool. He cleared his throat awkwardly. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. I've actually seen the movie. His voice lacked its usual confidence. Margaret turned her gentle gaze toward him. Oh? She said, not unkindly. Ryan nodded, suddenly aware of how small his words felt. Yeah, it was really good. He swallowed, scrambling for something more meaningful to say. I didn't know you wrote the book. Margaret simply gave a polite smile, offering no judgment. But the woman on the aisle seat wasn't as forgiving. She raised an eyebrow at him. So you had no idea you were sitting next to one of the greatest authors of our time? Ryan shifted uncomfortably. I guess not. Silence stretched between them for a moment. The murmurs of other passengers, the hum of the airplane, everything felt louder in the absence of his usual arrogance. Then, in a small voice, he said, I took your seat. He glanced at Margaret, his guilt plain on his face. I shouldn't have done that. Margaret studied him for a moment, then gave a small, knowing nod. No, you shouldn't have. Her honesty made him wince, but there was no anger in her tone, only simple truth. A flight attendant who had overheard the conversation approached with a kind smile. "Miss Lane, if you'd like, I can ask someone to switch so you can have your window seat." Margaret shook her head gently. "That's all right, dear. I've made peace with it." Ryan felt his stomach twist. She wasn't just gracious, she was better than him. She had every right to take back her seat, to make a fuss about how he had treated her. But instead, she had simply let it go. And somehow, that made his guilt even worse. The rest of the flight felt different to Ryan. The same seat, the same plane, but now a heaviness sat in his chest. Margaret didn't seem bothered. She continued writing in her notebook, her face peaceful. Occasionally, she exchanged kind words with the woman beside her, but she never once looked at Ryan with resentment or annoyance. And somehow, that made it worse. Ryan sat in silence, his thoughts swirling. He had judged her without knowing her, had taken something from her without considering how she felt. He had assumed, without a second thought, that he was more important. And yet, she was the one people admired. She was the one whose words had touched lives. As the plane began its descent, he finally found the courage to speak again. "Miss Lane?" he said, his voice quieter than before. Margaret looked up, waiting patiently. Ryan took a breath. "I'm really sorry. About the seat, about everything." Margaret studied him for a moment, then gave him a small, understanding smile. "It's never too late to be kind," she said gently. Ryan nodded, her words settling deep into his heart. When the plane landed, passengers stood up to gather their things. As Margaret stepped into the aisle, she was immediately greeted by a few excited fans waiting to catch a word with her. A young woman approached, clutching a copy of The Silent River with wide, eager eyes. Margaret greeted each of them with warmth, as if they were old friends. Ryan watched, feeling something shift inside him. He had spent the entire flight thinking of himself first. But Margaret, despite her success, despite the way people adored her, had never once acted like she was above anyone else. As he grabbed his bag and stepped off the plane, he made a quiet promise to himself. To be better. To treat people with kindness, whether he knew who they were or not. Because today, he had learned an important lesson. And he wouldn't forget it. Thank you for watching this heartfelt story. It's a powerful reminder that kindness and respect should never be based on who we think people are, but rather how we treat them as human beings. We all make mistakes, but it's never too late to change and learn from them. If this story touched you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to comment below and share your own experiences with kindness or lessons learned. And of course, share this story with someone who could use a little reminder about the importance of kindness. Thanks again for watching.